thank you all for joining us in this session. We are looking at the kinds of opportunities, considerations, mainly in the policy space when it comes to sustaining journalism, those aimed at journalism sustainability, but we'll also talk about a range of other factors. We are sitting here today as we have been experiencing both the massive shift and changes in technology, changes in public behavior in terms of getting news, access to new kinds of content in terms of the information space, increased risks to journalists in terms of online abuse, cyber threats, attacks, harassments, and now we have seen a government here that is taking actions that are very much around the realm of information control and press control, including not only things like keeping the AP out because of the way that they choose to call this body of water, and even overnight, executive actions that are moving the FCC and FTC much more into the executive branch to give the government more power over that. So in the mix of all of these things, how do we think about journalism sustainability? And what does that really mean in our country and in our world? We are here today to talk about a number of those factors, and we're not going to, we want to think, one of the things that CNTI looks at in terms of sustainability is trying to think about it in a really full sense of the term. That means revenue into the newsroom, sound financial policies. It means independence from government and other types of control. It means a diversity of voices to be able to serve the publics and to give different kinds of journalist voices into their communities. It means access to data, technological savviness, and public relevance, which is a part of technological savviness and usage. So as we think about all of those different components of sustainability, I'd like us to be able to look forward in terms of long-term planning, but I think we also have to start by looking at the right now, where we are right now. And to do that, I'm going to turn first to Tom Wheeler. I should say I'm not doing the intros, deep intros for everybody because they're in your program, and we don't have a ton of time for all of these great voices to be able to talk. We have a wonderful mix of panelists who come from a very wide range of vantage points, of perspectives, of the places and areas that they work. And I think that we did that intentionally because it's really important when we're looking at the broader question of sustainability to bring in a lot of different perspectives to the thinking and the conversation. So again, I'll turn first to Tom Wheeler, former chairman of the FCC, who also just had a piece come out this morning, I think, on some of the recent actions that have occurred around the reopening of the CBS case and other actions inside the FCC and what that may mean for long-term freedom of expression and freedom of the press. And so I'd first like to hear from you, Tom, in terms of what's at risk here with the current laws that we have. So even before we think about other kinds of policy opportunities or considerations, what are we facing inside the current structures that we have, the kind of risks that may be there?
Well, thank you, Amy, and it's great to be here with this distinguished panel. I would like to raise one thing on behalf of the audience, however. John Sands is standing over here. John, it is cruel and inhuman punishment to put a group like this in a freezing room like this with humongous windows looking out onto warmth.
He did get everybody to wear a jacket and look dressy.
I gotta tell you,
here,
it's okay. Anyway, so it's great to be here. Thank you. I'm, as Amy said, I'm the recovering regulator amongst people who are really on the front lines, like you all, dealing with journalism in these challenging times. And what my concern is looking at how, particularly the federal government, and particularly in the last couple of weeks, using the FCC is stepping out to try and affect content. There's actually a three-step process that we see going on right now. One is the technique, which is to assert a charge, open an investigation, and use that to coerce the target. CBS, coercion to release the tape that just happens to relate to President Trump's private suit, which he doubled to a $20 billion harm allege. The opening of investigations of PBS and NPR, and with the goal of going after their funding. The specific investigation of the PBS station in San Jose for their coverage of an ICE raid, an expansion of the FCC into online platforms where they have never been before, and the assertion in a letter to the CEOs of the major platforms that they are running a censorship cartel that must be dismantled immediately, quotes. And so we see that those kinds of actions using procedures that ignore due process and exploit the rather sizable powers of the chairman of the FCC to reach this conviction before trial kind of action without the involvement of the rest of the commission, to make a decision, and therefore to avoid, by not having a formal decision, to avoid judicial review. So you have this technique to coerce, a process to ignore procedures established for protection, with the effect that you end up behaving like we have always seen authoritarian governments behave, and that is to define a pre-existing vague concept, in this case, quote, the public interest, can't get much vaguer than that, to define that in a way that is helpful to you so that you can leverage on those individuals and institutions to do your will. We've seen that before. We shouldn't see it in this country.
And so, what can we do? Is there anything that we can do at this point inside these current laws? And then one of the other things. Yeah. So that's back to the we need to fight. That was a part of this morning's opening conversation, right? And in terms of implementation versus policy language, that's an area that you've spent time talking about too, the importance of thinking about implementation. So as we look forward into new kinds of policy areas, can you share a little bit about the ways that people might be wise to think about implementation beyond just the straight writing of the policy itself and getting it passed?
Implementation of these actions?
And no, of policy more broadly. And how can one create safeguards against any of these kinds
well,
of
I think, one of the things that I hope that we're going to talk about when we get up here, when we hear from the others, is we are a federal system of government. And we need to increasingly, unfortunately, rely on those great laboratories of democracy called state governments. And the individuals in this room and on this panel have the ability to deliver that message to those more targeted forums and perhaps and hopefully more rational decision makers.
Yeah, that's great, and we're going to get to that in just a minute. Before we do, I want to turn to Gina. A lot of the areas of policy up to now are focusing on revenue streams, right? Getting dollars into newsrooms, which is important. Part of what Dale talked about this morning is sustainability has all these other components as well. And one of the elements that's becoming increasingly important in journalism sustainability is access to technology and savviness and facility with technology. I'd be interested in your thoughts as executive editor of Semaphore, I should say, who is working a lot both in the technology space and with AI, doing a lot of AI development. Your thoughts on where there might be important policy areas to be thinking about when it comes to access, and how that can impact both large and smaller kinds of news organizations.
Thanks, Amy. 2 quick digressions. One, thank you, John, for the view. We get it, you don't. It's cold, but we got something to look at. 2, I don't know very much about policy, so I'm not going to run too deep into policy. But just to riff for a second on Tom's thing, I mean, this is not new. This has happened. I spent most of my career working in jurisdictions that had none of the freedoms of this place, right? Singapore, Philippines, Vietnam, Hong Kong. So I think it'd be actually really helpful, and I know some people are doing this already, just to get some of the experiences from elsewhere and what people did and what worked, what didn't work, what was successful, what was unsuccessful, and how to work under some of these conditions, I think, as well, and find ways through it. And I would just highly recommend, this is one of those times where Americans should be learning from the rest of the world. Thank you very much. But then just to shift a little bit to, there is this tsunami of actions, not quite laws, but implementation of laws, and that is changing the information landscape. But there's another one, right, which is coming. Again, whatever government was in power is coming, and that is the reshaping of the information landscape through generative AI and various other things that all lump into the AI bucket. And I think we'd be foolish to focus only on one thing, even though this is the burning fire, to not think about the other thing that is going to change. And so just on a sort of a purely basic level, as and if funding ever comes to work on AI things in newsrooms, certainly beyond the money and beyond the sort of the basics of revenue streams, I think sort of making sure that we do have the appropriate infrastructure, that we have systems, models that work and that are stable enough to build tools on, which currently on the commercial models, if you're using them, they change every other week, and it's kind of problematic to build mission critical tools on them. But I think the more critical thing, which I really want to sort of just put a bug in people's head, is that if you look at how people come to information now, you look at what they're getting on Bing, whether Perplexity or Google, and you may not like the ways the answers come out, and you might argue that these are terrible systems and people should not listen to them. But they are, and they will. And if we sort of sit and say, well, that's not the way you should do it, well, you go to war with the audience you have, not the audience you would like to have, and we are in danger of missing this boat again. We miss the internet, we miss social media, and if we miss this one, people are going to go and change. So we have to kind of understand how it is that people are going to come to information, what they will accept, what error rate they will accept. And we have to figure out the ways that's happening. We have to plan to be in those spaces. And, and so look, I'll just give you a really, really quick example. If you know that Donald Trump is the 47th president of the United States, you don't need that. Donald Trump, 47th president of the United States, right? That can go away. But maybe you don't, and then you should have it. I should be able to build you in real time with a generative AI system a story that knows what you already know, that knows whether you are, because you have one of these, whether you are standing in line at a bank and have time to read 500 words, or whether you are jogging and need it changed into an audio alert, or whether you are driving a car and should not be reading. But the point is, we can do all this. People are going to do this, whether we like it or not. We need to figure out how to get there. And I think as we move on and think about the policy implications of that, as states come up with regulations to encourage things, I think the great danger in all of that is that we ossify ourselves into a state of what we would like to be, as opposed to a state of what people are going to become.
Yeah, that's terrific. And I'd be interested, Chris, as the head of Lion, Local Independent Online News Publishers Association, your experience in working with smaller, more diverse digital startups in the policy space, certainly writ large in terms of a voice at the table, but specifically too in this area of technology and AI, again, it's a combination not just of access, but how does one in a smaller newsroom, news operation, be able to gain that facility, that grounding, foundational knowledge of technology, ways to use it, ways to engage with those audiences who, as Gina says, are there and are going to be using it, whether it's coming from journalism organizations or not.
Yeah, I mean, I think as that affects policy, so at Lion, I've been at Lion for almost 6 years now. We started being active on the policy front about 2.5 years ago at the federal level when there was pending legislation, and it took up a lot of my time last year, so I raised enough money to hire a full-time director of policy and advocacy who's just started. And broadly speaking, this may shock you, but the legislation that's being sort of pushed by lobbyists at the state and federal level is typically written by large media companies, large legacy companies, who tend to exclude our members from even being considered as publishers, right? They sort of write laws with sort of revenue numbers that are unlikely for these very small places to hit. Those publishers tend to find out about these things very defensively as laws have been written and are being considered for passage, and so we wind up sort of trying to mobilize them at the last minute, and I'm excited that we have somebody who, because that's not going to happen at the federal level right now, obviously, right? This Congress isn't going to write those kinds of laws. But at the state level in places like California and now Illinois and Oregon and all these other places where we're seeing baby versions of this pop up at the state level, activating our members, educating our members about what these laws mean, how they might affect their businesses, and encouraging them not to bash the hedge funds that wrote the legislation, but to just introduce themselves to the lawmakers and ask, could you help us? Like, we got laid off by these hedge funds. These are news deserts that exist because they pulled back. So it's good that you want to help them, but could you help me? I mortgaged my house. I took out a second loan to launch my newsroom. I am not taking a salary for a year as I get this started. Can you help me? And that's been pretty effective in our experience in California, certainly. And so we're trying to replicate that in other places as these laboratories for democracy start cooking up new things or repurposing old things in other places. Specifically around AI, it's kind of interesting. There's a bill that was introduced a little while ago in New Jersey to try to regulate AI in the news business. One of the elements of the bill tries to make it illegal for newsrooms to lay off a journalist by replacing them with AI. I'm not sure how you track that. Another mandates the labeling of any piece of content that generative AI was used in the production of, and starts levying $3,000 fines per incidence of that infraction, right? So just consider if you're using an automated service to turn a sports score into a news story, and you don't label that, and you do 300 of those overnight, you can't afford those fines, right? And there's we're not sure that bill's going to go anywhere. But this is what's happening, right, in these states around this technology that's just being introduced with uneven rates of adoption, and it could have no impact on members like ours or huge impact on members like ours. This is sort of the state of that lab right now.
And it's also why, if I can say, as a place that does research, so important to have research as a part of what goes into the thinking of these kinds of policies, because most of the research today shows that a straight label, AI, non-AI, actually backfires in terms of service to the public, creates more distrust with your audiences. Part of that's because of the way audiences have been trained to respond and think about AI based on the coverage and other kinds of information that they're getting about AI. But this is, again, why it's so important to have a lot of proactive, thorough thinking and conversation that looks at things a lot of different ways before something goes into writing like that. One more question to you before I turn to Steve. On the in the definitions of journalism, and it's one thing to be able to get the voice and be recognized as an important player in a local news space. One of the things CNTI has looked at too is the very question of how is journalism defined? Where is the money going inside these policies? And there's certainly been evolutions and I think greater awareness to those kinds of things. So I'd be interested in where you've seen sort of good examples or successes or the kinds of things that are really important to think about when the language is written around both who is included and who gets the money in the end and where that goes.
I defer to Steve on that. Steve, Rebuild Local News. So I serve.
Yeah.
I'm lucky enough to have been serving on Steve's steering committee for the last few years at Rebuild Local News. And one of the things that Rebuild's been really good at, and Steve should definitely talk about this, not me, is trying to figure out the world of the possible and the ways that these definitions can sort of be worked out so that it's kind of like bipartisan, platform neutral in its outlay, trying to make sure that you can cut, like the pink slime sites are not sort of able to access these kinds of efforts, right? And that it's doing what we intended to do. But Steve, you should talk about that.
Steve.
Well, when we first put together Rebuild Local News Coalition starting in 2020 as a collection of different groups, we now have 30 different national and state associations and organizations. We started with a set of principles. And nonpartisan was one, platform neutral was one. This is not about helping newspapers, it's not about helping nonprofits, it's about making sure there are enough journalists, local reporters in communities. And the other thing we said is future friendly. And what we meant by that was that very often anyone who has either worked in government or studied it is, policy made by the people who are there. And so policy has a tendency to be backward looking because it is often very crafted by the people who are legacy players. And we thought needs to be a balance on that too, of both helping legacy players to both survive and transform, and also policy that will help create outlets that don't even exist yet. And so that has led to, I think, a focus on reporters as like the kind of core thing as opposed to outlets, in the sense that the consistency, even if the outlets and the means of distribution and everything is going to change over time, we believe anyway that the constant theme needs to be that there need to be enough reporters on the ground in communities. So that's kind of what has ended up tying it all up in a bow.
And how do you define a reporter? So that can get harder also, right, with independent journalists, people who are working outside organizations. One of the lovely things about journalism for many, many, as it's been known, is that it's a craft and it doesn't have, a solid license, a kind of thing that really puts you in this bucket. And we have data coming out and that talks about the public's sense that a very strong sense of what journalism is and the mission and the ethics and the kind of work that goes into it, but that anybody could do that. So that becomes challenging too.
Yeah, and there are specific answers around particular pieces of legislation. They tend to focus on let me just say, back up for a second, which is, given what Tom was talking about, that we're in a period of attacks and where any government money has the potential of being used as a hammer against the press, it may seem a little bit absurd to be looking for legislation to provide government money to the press. Like, why don't we hand out hammers? And I want to talk about that. There are ways of doing it where you can preserve yourself. But I used to, this was several years ago, when someone would come to us with an idea, I've got an idea for how you could do this program, and the first thing I would say was like, that sounds really great. Now, imagine Steve Bannon is running it. Does it still work? And if the answer is no, then it's not a good idea. Like we have to, and that knocks out 90% of the ideas, honestly, because you can't create public policy with the idea that people you like are in charge of it, or the people you trust. And so we should be honest about that. Like public policy is a blunt instrument, and you want to try to create it in a way, especially when it's coming to subsidies, you want to try to create it in a way that involves objective criteria, neutral standards, not subjective judgments. And for the more nuanced subjective judgments about, well, this newsroom is better than that newsroom, or this is an underserved area, that's what foundations are for. Like that's how these two should, kind of coexist with each other. We should be realistic about what government can and can't do. So I'll give an example of how different, in the laboratories of democracy, one of the more creative ways that has arisen to deal with both the definitional questions but also these kind of free press questions is a bill that was just proposed in Kansas, a red state, supermajority Republican state. It is a tax credit for small businesses that advertise in local news. The actual subsidy goes to restaurants and grocery stores and dry cleaners if they advertise in local news. Well, that's pretty clever because, if a governor wants to penalize the press by cutting off this program, they're cutting off the subsidies to restaurants and dry cleaners and grocery stores. It also means that there's no one at the government making decisions about which media organization we like or dislike. Now, there's disadvantages too. It's a kind of market mechanism. It's going to be uneven. These restaurants are going to choose who they want to choose. They're going to choose the publications that they think will help them reach their audience. So it's very market-oriented that way, but I think that's a good thing. And so I guess what I'm saying is both of these things can be true at the same time. We have to be really, to oversimplify this as offense and defense, we have to really up our defensive game right now because the attacks are going to come from many places, many directions, using many techniques, and I do worry that we're not ready for this.
So on that topic, right, anybody who's worked in this space in the last 5 years, we've struggled to even define sustainability for these newsrooms, and the treadmill was set to level. The government was indifferent to us. If it was, it really isn't that hard to get your 501c3 designation, or at least it hasn't been. I think that's changing, right? The treadmill is on an incline now. And our definition of sustainability is going to have to change as well because it's going to be whatever slings and arrows we can handle on the way. It just got a lot harder.
But I don't think we should give up on the offense, the trying to get legislation that helps with the economic sustainability, because at the end of the day, economically weak news organizations are weak news organizations.
I think it's just going to be really uneven, right? It depends on the state,
and
right?
Quite difficult.
Yeah.
But we have to try to do both.
And that Kansas model, that's really interesting because, one of the things I believe that was a part of the opposition to Glazer's bill that he was talking about this morning was it was another kind of tax element, but the businesses were saying it actually in the end penalizes us because then we're going to, have to charge more for our ads, and so this kind of flips it in a little way. Would you?
Well, that's true. It creates allies out of the business community instead of enemies. That argument was the argument that Amazon went to the small businesses with to try to help defeat the bill. I didn't.
Nice small business you have there. Shame if anything happened to it, right?
Yeah.
That was the.
Yeah, I didn't think that was a particularly valid argument. But yes, and I do think that this is one of the things that we meaning the journalism world, have to think about, which is. We can't just have this be a special interest pleading of help us in the news industry because we're suffering, though that's true. We have to convince the rest of society that this matters. Now that's true philanthropically too. Like, what I just said has to, you could say the same thing for why we need to do that to get readers or visits to our events or philanthropy. But it's true in the public policy realm also. Imagine the difference in a place like Kansas if the lead coalition pushing this is the Small Business Association versus the Press Association. And to do that, you can't BS them. It has to actually be true. Like, it has to actually be true and it is, for most of these small businesses, that they want a healthy local news system. It is economically depressing and emotionally in these communities if there's not a healthy local news ecosystem. So we have to broaden the argument out to include businesses, civic organizations, labor unions, that this isn't about journalism jobs. This is about the health of communities.
Can I just jump in there for a second? This is a strange thing to say, but I keep sitting here and listening to this debate, this discussion, and I keep hearing James Madison, okay? Because I think it was in one of the Federalist Papers, 12, I think, that he wrote, "Ambition must be made to counteract ambition." Okay? We know what the ambition of the other side is, all right? And we know what the ambition of, to Steve's point, the coalition that can be put together to be an effective offset to that is. And so when you go looking to express yourself, you need to first build the coalition that can do that. And it's not good enough to say, yes, but I'm really important. I'm a really good person. And I think that far too often, so many entities want to fall back on that and say, oh, you just got to, I'm important, and you know that you can't let this happen to me. No, you got to build your coalition to go in and say, this is why it is important that you act this way for all of us. Gina, I can hear you over here.
This is the part where I lose my journalism card and I make a lot of enemies, but I always do this anyway, which is I was at a panel, I think it was Perugia, and somebody said, but what about all the journalism jobs? And my answer has always been, we are not here to save journalists, and we're not actually even technically here to save journalism. We're here to save information in the public interest.
To inform communities in another, right? It's about the community.
It's about the
not
customer. It's
right.
like, we're a service, we're in public service, and you know what service industry is? It's would you like fries with that? And we have to reframe, and it's like I'm agreeing violently with everyone, we have to reframe the argument as to what do we provide people, and what do they want, and what do they need. And I know what we all want to do, right? Everybody wants to take down the next government, or whatever it is. And a lot of people just want to know, like, who's fixing the pothole on their street.
Who raised my taxes?
Yeah, and and so this is where I do think we have this huge opportunity. I think, and it's sort of it's a mishmash of everything, which includes sort of business model and includes sustainability. I think if we do genuinely believe that there is a potential for a new media ecosystem, information ecosystem that is mediated through AI systems that actually can generate information that is particular and useful to people because they actually want that information and know more and know less of it, then I think we have a really strong argument that this is something that people feel is useful to them. You said to people, like, let's get rid of Google because it's an evil company that, sorry, is Richard in the room? That takes it. People don't want it gone because it does a lot of stuff for them, right? And even though you put up with a whole bunch of things with it, and the point is we need to get to that place. And there are all sorts of dangers in that world. And I can think of a zillion of them in terms of like targeted persuasion that's built exactly to your specifications, and I think that's way more of a problem than misinformation is going to be. But again, that's the world we're going to be in, and so we're going to be in that world. Let's figure out how to play that world well.
Go ahead, Steve. Are you waiting to say something? The point I was going to raise that I think is exactly to yours, Gina, which is that a part of that coalition has to be the public. and the public has to see what is being produced as relevant and interesting and what they are looking for and desiring, whether it is about whether my street will be closed on the way to work today, or who raised my taxes, or what's happening long term in the economy or at the national level.
But the issue is, the last time I was in this room, just minutes ago, previous, not the immediately preceding, but another panel, was quoting Elon Musk saying, "We are the media." Okay, and the problem is that that's where the people are going, even for potholes.
And that's why we have to get there first.
I agree. Right. And but it's not enough just to say that we're the answer to fixing the potholes.
We had an interesting, when we were working on the federal legislation with America's newspapers and others, and it was pretty bipartisan. This last version had 21 Republicans and 21 Democrats as co-sponsors. But it was very interesting that the way Republicans supporters talked about it was different from the way Democratic supporters talked about it. Democratic supporters talked about it in terms of this threat to democracy. Republican supporters talked about it in terms of the threat to community.
This was the tax credits for reporters?
Yeah. I thought that was fascinating, because of course both are true. Like, both are true. But it was, I would say that, if you're thinking as a publisher, the right way to think about it is the individual and what service you're providing them. If you're thinking in terms of public policy, which is maybe one layer up, I think we have to think about it, as you were saying, in terms of the health of communities. That's going to be the area of common ground. People know that their communities don't function. They can't address the problems in their communities. They are more polarized. There is more misinformation. The economics get worse. There's more corruption. All those things we all know about if you don't have healthy local news.
Let me ask one question follow-up that gets us to a little bit about the state level policy versus federal. And I'm going to turn to some audience questions, so get them in your heads. There will be mics in just a minute coming around. But when we think about that sort of the element of state versus federal and communities, which I think is the core, right, of connection and vibrancy, and local news is really the core of so much in terms of engagement in our societies. Does that at some point create a patchwork nation? An area where how do policies cross borders, especially in the digital realm? How do we think about the way that this supports our nation as a democracy, as opposed to many, many different communities? And I'd welcome
Well, we
thoughts from
kind of do,
anybody.
right? The settlement that we talked about this morning, that Senator Glazer was, railing against, means California is going to have millions of dollars and hand out millions of dollars in its state this year that no other state will yet, because no other state has that kind of mechanism, even though it's actually not set up in California yet. That's the precedent. And so I think in Oregon, I believe, in Illinois, in New York, you're going to start seeing other efforts to either pass those laws like Senator Glazer's or settle in those places too. But that means there's going to be 4 states by the end of the year probably that have some money going to journalism, and then 46 where there won't be. And it's going to sort of start broadening, I think, that blue-red state divide a little further.
Yeah, I mean, look, I would love to have federal legislation, but it's not going to happen. So it's going to be on the state level, and are not going to happen for several years. And I'm not so worried about the patchwork nature on the support side. There is a little bit of a patchwork issue on the taxation side. If you want to have taxes on tech companies to help pay for that, then that may become a little bit complicated if you do it. But right now, I think we're actually seeing the actual best of the laboratories of democracy happening. New York passed a bill that was tax credits for journalists. Illinois passed one that did that, but they added a thing where they said, we're going to have a bigger benefit if it's a new hire. And we're going to say there's 120-day, if you're going to sell your company to an out-of-state company, there's a 120-day waiting period so that the communities can potentially organize a bid. Kansas is saying, actually, we would like to do this through the business subsidy.
But New York's law excluded nonprofit newsrooms because it was a tax they don't pay, right?
Yes, so that's a whole different lesson and moral of the story, which is, all of these
Fine print.
things. What's that?
Read the fine print.
Read the fine print. But also,
Yes.
passage of a law is not the end point, it's the middle point. And you need to follow up around implementation to try to fix the problems with the law. But in any event, my point is that, this is a little bit of a new area in some ways, the government has been supporting the media, as Tom has written in his book, for a long, long time, whether it's communications policy on the broadcast side or postal subsidies for newspapers or public notices. This is not a new concept. But this approach to sort of these new kinds of direct subsidies, some of them are new. We should have some humility about it. We're figuring this out. We're figuring the right way to do this. And so I think it's actually probably a good thing that we're going to try this out, different approaches in different states.
Yay and verily. 2 points.
I haven't had a very.
That was way more old English.
Madison and
if
then
you're-
barely.
If you're following on your bingo card,
No, but
that's
there-
the
but
third
there-
founding
Yes.
father.
there are 2 points here. One, these efforts are doing something, right? Back to your offense versus defense. Get on the offense. And one of the things that folks on my side of the aisle tend to do, and I hope it's our side of the aisle, but tend to do too much is we fight amongst ourselves as to what's the right answer rather than just go out and do it and let's get rolling. The second point, though, is, okay, so you come up with X number of differing state laws. Red states say this, blue states say this, that blue state says this, something else. That is going to be a forcing mechanism in and of itself. Okay, we go back to the fact, how did our country begin? It began with the Annapolis Convention because the colonies were each having their own sets of rules that were screwing up commerce. And so we said, let's get together and figure out, and that then led to the Constitutional Convention. These kinds of conflicts aren't bad, they're good. And you want to encourage them. And that encouragement starts with action. And it won't be perfect, and it won't be something we can all agree on. But by God, it's doing something.
And then maybe there's a way we can
Break
have
into
a
song
kind
at
of
this point, I think.
convention where different, states that have passed legislation come together and share what's worked and what hasn't worked. What do we learn from what we passed, and how can another state actually get this included or have more at the table or ensure technology and that sort of thing. Audience questions?
Thank you. Courtney Radstrom, Center for Journalism and Liberty. So question around the state policies, to your point about the concern about who's in power and that whole thing. To what extent have you looked at Europe, which has a much longer tradition of public policy support? And as you know, we've done a lot of comparative work to look at the news media bargaining codes around the world, but I wonder if we've done the same thing, so I'd be interested to hear from you about that. And then could you talk a little bit about the public policy support? We talk about media policy and journalism support often in a very narrow sense, but if you think about, especially from the last platform, fixing the market imbalances would be very helpful for addressing some of the structural challenges that media have, not only with their business models, but now with visibility when you have the manipulation of the platforms by tech billionaires. So could you talk about how does that fit into, or how do you think that should fit into public policy agenda?
So on what we can learn from the rest of the world, there's a lot, and especially Canada Canada on public policy for local news is several years ahead of us. Other countries have done things too, but if you talk to people in Canada about they have 4 or 5 different things that they put into place 2 or 3 years ago. The thing they say has made the biggest difference is what they call the labor subsidy, which is the equivalent of the employment tax credit over here. Well, that's pretty interesting. Like that is real-time, evidence for it. On the question of structural and power imbalances, okay, I'm going to get in trouble here. I think there are 2 structural imbalances. One has to do with the power of tech firms, the other has to do with the power of hedge funds. Both have been problems in our industry. The original the original cause of the collapse of business models is that advertising went to the platforms. Once that started happening, the consolidation of the newspaper industry and especially the dominance of hedge funds made it way worse and harder to solve. So I think you have to look at both of those things. On the tech part of it, which is the part that, frankly, to some degree, the consolidation is the cows are out of the barn on the newspaper side, but the tech part of this is still very live, very real. So for up until recently, there was basically one idea on the table on how to deal with this, and it was what's called the bargaining code approach. And it was pioneered in Australia, and it was basically to compel tech platforms to compensate news organizations for content, which, as a concept, we agree with. We think there are other ways.
Some of us agree with.
What's that?
Some of us agree with.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But we think that approach, we have other approaches that we think might be as good or better. I'll put it that way. Now that I know that Chris is listening.
I had a big lunch, but I'm not that tired.
Senator Glazer's bill is an example of this. So Senator Glazer's bill did a similar sort of calibration of power using the tax code and saying that, you don't have to believe that the tech companies are evil or did wrong or that they were even maliciously trying to harm the local news industry to nonetheless acknowledge that they are the big winners of the tech revolution, and the big losers of the tech revolution is democracy and the health of communities, and so that it is fair to ask the tech companies to help pay for the collateral damage, whether they caused it maliciously or not. That we do believe that is, a reasonable thing to do, but there are a number of different ways at this. And I will say, when New York passed its tax credit when New York passed its tax credit for local news that was funded out of general treasury, we didn't complain that, oh, this is no good because you didn't ding the tech companies to pay for it. We think it's also fine for governments to say this is a public good and the public ought to support it. So where I may disagree slightly with Chris is I think you would be happier if that was all we did, and I think it's also fine.
No, I think Senator Glazer, I understand what he's doing, but I think you can't conflate the things that you conflated there. I think that, so you have to understand the sites that we represent don't have the kind of need that these large legacy places that have been hollowed out have. So a startup newsroom, a small newsroom doesn't need millions and millions of dollars. And with getting into a single point of failure system that the hedge fund sort of evolved into means they needed this very large bailout to be able to claim success. That's not true for my members. It's just not true. And conflating all of those places with being pillars of democracy is also not true. It's unaligned.
Can I complain for a minute?
Sure.
Okay.
Yea,
Now-
verily.
Now we're down. now we're down to arguing amongst ourselves and not solving the problem. Okay. Sure. Let me go to the point that Courtney raised about tech giants. For 25 years, we have allowed policy to ignore the adverse effects of the new technology on society and economy, and the economy. One of those effects has hit all the people in this room and the impact on journalism. It's a done deal. It's happened. We're not going to put that genie back in the bottle. But to go to Gina's point, okay, about what's coming next with AI, if we allow the same kind of winner-takes-all concentration amongst a handful of giants who have the technological capability and the cash to build it, if we allow AI to get to that same point, and it appears to be on course and speed right now, because nobody is willing to step up, then we're in even deeper trouble. And the kind of solutions that Gina's been talking about that I believe in, that AI can offer, aren't going to be there, or they're going to be controlled by somebody that you'll have to go and pay tribute to.
And this is where ambition, the appeal essentially is you don't want those people in power because you will eventually have to kowtow to them, and so you should. Just one point of helpful information, Courtney, that has nothing to do with fighting with anybody, so I'm not fighting with anyone here, just to be clear. IFPIM, the International Fund for Public Interest Media, which I'm on the board of, which is a great organization, has been going around trying to encourage more of these codes. They've had success in South Africa, they're working in Taiwan, and so there's more of this going on, and they're trying to plant the bug, offer themselves up as honest brokers to try and get through some of the issues that you're talking about so that it's not dominated by the legacy players, and sort of try to insert themselves, try to pull some of the smaller players, and as a practical matter, essentially, in the way I put it, but I don't say it in public, we're very happy to be the laundromat, right? Give us the money and we'll wash it, and then we'll give it out, and everyone can feel good about it. It's true. People don't want, money. Some people will not take money from Meta. Some people will not take money from
Meta's
whatever.
not giving out money anymore, but good
Yeah,
point.
no. But at one point, right? It was like when you could stand on principle, like, I'm not taking money from these people. Like, yeah, we'll launder it. It's okay. All money is dirty. Whatever. You could talk to me afterwards.
Could I ask Tom a question? Or I don't
Yeah,
wanna
I'm
ta-
going to
no,
say
go
we
ahead.
are at time, and so I was going to try to get one. I know this is so fascinating. We could talk for 18 hours. Okay, let me just take one more, and then we'll do a quick wrap up. I see somebody there. Sorry, I saw.
Hi, I'll try to make it quick. I'm the publisher of the Fort Worth Report in Texas, and Steve, your story about Kansas prompted a quick story and then a question about that. The story isn't that I was meeting recently with the director of the Kimball Art Museum, which is an internationally renowned museum, and what was fascinating to me was he told me that his ability to reach a international audience through the New York Times was easier for him than trying to reach the million people in Fort Worth because the legacy paper had been hollowed out completely. And it was the easiest sale of my career. He was thanking us for being there and writing a check for us to basically share the story in our newsletters and of the Kimball Art Museum. So that really resonated with me, and that's my question is, what prompted Kansas to go in this direction, and what lessons can we learn from that to get that happening in Texas and elsewhere? So it seems like a brilliant solution, really, to me.
Well, to be honest, we were hawking this idea all over the place, and Kansas was interested. That's kind of how it happened.
He's got a lot of miles under his belt these days in his state travel. Yeah. This has been fabulous, and I think certainly we can take away from this conversation that really working to create healthy digital environments that provide the public with solid factual information through good mission-driven reporting is critical to the functioning of communities, to democracy. figuring out the kinds of structures, whether it's legislative policies or other kinds of work, is also very complicated. Takes a lot of thinking, a lot of experimentation, a lot of creativity, and a lot of different voices in the room. So thank you so much to all of these panelists, and we hope you'll continue the conversation.